Marcus Chen had always believed his childhood was ordinary. Growing up in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Queens, watching his mother Sarah clip coupons every Sunday morning while his father David worked double shifts at the accounting firm downtown. The worn linoleum floors, the secondhand furniture, the careful way his parents counted bills at the kitchen table, it all painted a picture of a family living paycheck to paycheck, making every dollar stretch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 28, Marcus had carved out a decent life as a software engineer in Manhattan. Nothing flashy, but stable. He paid his student loans on time, sent his parents a few $100s each month when he could spare it, and had managed to save enough for a small studio apartment in Brooklyn. He thought he understood his place in the world. That understanding shattered on a Tuesday morning in October when a certified letter arrived at his office. Marcus stared at the envelope, bearing the letterhead of Morrison, Keller Associates, a law firm he'd never heard of. His hands trembled slightly as he tore it open, expecting perhaps some administrative error or a case of mistaken identity. What he found instead was a letter that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about his family. Dear Mr. Chen, we are writing to inform you that you are the primary beneficiary of the Eleanor Chen Memorial Trust, established in 1995 following the passing of your grandmother. As you have now reached the age stipulated in the trust documents, you are entitled to receive full disclosure of the trust's holdings and management history. Marcus read this sentence 3 times before the words began to make sense. His grandmother, Eleanor, had died when he was 3 years old. He had vague memories of her, a small woman with kind eyes who always smelled of jasmine tea and kept hard candies in her purse. His parents had told him she lived modestly, that she'd left behind only a few personal items and some old photographs. The letter continued. The current value of the trust is approximately $2.3 million, consisting of real estate holdings, investment accounts, and accumulated interest over the past 25 years. However, our records indicate significant irregularities in the trust's management that require immediate attention. The office around Marcus seemed to fade into white noise. His coworkers' conversations became distant murmurs. The clicking of keyboards turned into background static. $2.3 million? His grandmother, the woman his parents described as a simple immigrant who worked in a laundry and saved every penny, had left him over $2 million. But that wasn't the part that made his stomach clench with dread. It was the phrase, significant irregularities, that sent ice through his veins. The lawyer, Robert Morrison, had requested a meeting at his earliest convenience. Marcus called immediately, his voice shaking as he explained who he was. Morrison's secretary scheduled him for that same afternoon, her tone professional but tinged with what Marcus could only describe as sympathy. The Morrison, Keller Associates office occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown. Marcus felt underdressed in his casual Friday jeans and button-down shirt as he rode the elevator to the 32nd floor. The waiting area was all marble and leather, the kind of place that whispered of old money and serious legal matters. Robert Morrison was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades delivering difficult news. He shook Marcus's hand with a firm grip and gestured for him to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his massive oak desk. Mr. Chen, I want to start by saying that what I'm about to tell you may be disturbing. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman who worked very hard to ensure your future would be secure. Unfortunately, it appears that security has been compromised. Morrison opened a thick manila folder and spread several documents across his desk. Eleanor Chen immigrated from Taiwan in 1962 with very little, but she was extraordinarily frugal and business-minded. She purchased several small properties in Queens and Brooklyn when real estate was cheap, ran a successful alterations business, and invested wisely. By the time she passed away in 1995, she had accumulated substantial wealth. Marcus leaned forward, studying the documents Morrison pointed to. Property deeds, bank statements, investment records, all bearing his grandmother's name and dates spanning from the 1960s through the mid-1990s. She established this trust specifically for you, her only grandchild, with very clear instructions. The trust was to be managed conservatively, with funds released for your education, and the principal to be transferred to you at age 28. Your parents, David and Sarah Chen, were named as trustees. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His parents had known. They'd known about the trust, about the money, about his grandmother's wishes. They'd known while they lived in that cramped apartment, while they struggled with bills, while Marcus had taken out student loans and worked nights to pay for college. Morrison continued, his voice gentle but relentless. According to the trust documents, funds should have been available for your education. The trust could have easily covered your college expenses, living costs, even graduate school if you'd chosen that path. Instead, our investigation shows that significant withdrawals have been made over the years, always with paperwork signed by your parents as trustees. Marcus found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. How much? Approximately $850,000 has been withdrawn from the trust over the past 15 years. The withdrawals accelerated significantly after 2010. The number hung in the air between them like a verdict. Marcus felt the familiar weight of his student loan payments, the memory of working in the cafeteria to afford textbooks, the countless times he'd eaten ramen noodles for dinner because it was all he could afford. All of it while nearly $1 million sat in a trust with his name on it. What did they use the money for? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Morrison pulled out another set of documents, property purchases. A house in Westchester County purchased in 2011 for $400,000, a vacation home in the Hamptons bought in 2015 for $320,000. Various investments, a luxury car, private school tuition for your cousin Jenny, David's brother's daughter. Marcus's mind reeled. The house in Westchester. His parents had moved there 5 years ago, claiming David had finally gotten a promotion that allowed them to upgrade from their Queens apartment. Marcus had been proud of them, had thought they'd finally achieved the American dream through hard work and sacrifice. The vacation home they had mentioned casually, saying Sarah's company had given them a bonus and they'd decided to invest in a small place where they could relax. All of it paid for with his money. His grandmother's legacy, intended for his future, had been systematically stripped away to fund his parents' secret life of comfort while he struggled. "Is this legal?" Marcus managed to ask. Morrison's expression grew grim. "Technically, as trustees, your parents had authority to make withdrawals for your benefit. However, the law requires that such withdrawals actually benefit the beneficiary. Private school for your cousin, luxury vacation homes, and investment properties that aren't held in your name, these clearly don't meet that standard. What they've done constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty, and depending on how the court views their actions, potentially theft." Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over Manhattan.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The city sprawled below him, millions of people living their lives unaware that his entire understanding of reality had just collapsed. He thought about all the times he'd felt grateful to his parents for their sacrifices, all the times he'd sent them money because he thought they were struggling. "There's more," Morrison said quietly. Marcus turned back, unsure if he could handle any additional revelations. "The trust documents specify that you should have been informed of its existence when you turned 18. There's also a provision requiring annual statements to be sent to you starting at age 21. We have no record of you ever receiving these documents." The betrayal was complete. Not only had his parents stolen from him, they'd actively concealed the theft, allowing him to believe they were a struggling family when they were living comfortably on his inheritance. Marcus slumped back into the chair, his head in his hands. "What happens now?" "That's entirely up to you, Mr. Chen. You have several options. You could demand immediate restitution, which would require your parents to return the money they've improperly withdrawn. You could file a civil lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, or you could pursue criminal charges for theft. The evidence is quite clear that they violated their responsibilities as trustees. Morrison paused, then added more gently, I understand this is your family we're talking about. These decisions are never easy, but I want you to understand that your grandmother worked her entire life to provide for your future. She specifically structured this trust to ensure you'd have opportunities she never had. Your parents have undermined those wishes for their own benefit. Marcus left the law office in a daze. The bustling streets of Manhattan felt surreal, as if he were walking through a movie set rather than the city he'd lived in for years. He found himself on a bench in Central Park, staring at the documents Morrison had given him copies of. Property deeds, withdrawal records, bank statements, all proof that his life had been built on a lie. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Hope you're having a good day, honey. Dad and I are thinking about you." The casual normalcy of the message felt like a slap. How could they text him about having a good day when they'd been systematically stealing from him for over a decade? How could they ask about his life while living a life funded by his money? Marcus didn't respond to the text. Instead, he called his best friend Jake, a fellow software engineer who'd known him since college. "Marcus, you sound terrible. What's wrong?" "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Have my parents ever seemed, I don't know, like they were doing better financially than they let on?" There was a pause. "That's a weird question, man. Why are you asking?" "Just please think about it. Anything that seemed off." Another pause, longer this time. "Well, now that you mention it, there was that time we visited them at their new house in Westchester. It's pretty nice, and your mom was wearing this designer handbag and your dad had that expensive watch. But they've always been careful with money, so I figured they'd just saved up." "What about when we went to their place in the Hamptons last summer?" "Yeah, that place is incredible. Must be worth $500,000 at least. But again, I just thought they'd been smart with their investments or something. Why? What's going on?" Marcus couldn't bring himself to explain over the phone. "I'll call you later, Jake. I need to process some things." That evening, Marcus sat in his small Brooklyn studio, surrounded by the modest possessions that represented his life. His secondhand furniture, his carefully budgeted groceries, his laptop that was 3 years old because he couldn't afford to upgrade. All of it suddenly felt like evidence of a massive deception. He opened his laptop and began researching his options. The more he read about fiduciary responsibility and trust law, the angrier he became. His parents hadn't just made questionable decisions, they'd systematically violated their legal obligations while watching him struggle financially. The next morning, Marcus called in sick to work and drove to Westchester. He'd been to his parents' house dozens of times since they'd moved there, but now he saw it with new eyes. The perfectly landscaped yard, the new BMW in the driveway, the additions they'd claimed to have saved for over years, all of it took on a different meaning. His mother answered the door with her usual warm smile, immediately pulling him into a hug. "Marcus, what a wonderful surprise! I was just making lunch. Are you hungry?" "We need to talk," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. Something in his tone made Sarah's smile falter. From a law firm representing the Eleanor Chen Memorial Trust. The color drained from both of his parents' faces. David slowly folded his newspaper, while Sarah's hand went to her throat in a gesture Marcus recognized from childhood, something she did when she was nervous. "Marcus," David began, his voice careful, "we can explain." "Can you?" Marcus interrupted, opening the folder and spreading the documents across the counter. "Can you explain why I've been paying student loans for 7 years when there was money set aside for my education? Can you explain why you bought a $400,000 house with money my grandmother left for me? Can you explain why you've been letting me send you money every month while you've been living off my inheritance?" Sarah started crying, but Marcus felt no sympathy. These weren't tears of remorse, they were tears of someone who'd been caught. We were going to tell you, she whispered. When? When I turned 30? 40? Never? David stood up, his face flushing red. Now wait just a minute. We raised you, we fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head. We sacrificed everything for you, and you're going to begrudge us a little help from money that was just sitting there? The audacity of the statement took Marcus's breath away. A little help? You stole nearly $1 million from me, money my grandmother specifically set aside for my future. We didn't steal anything, David shot back. We were the trustees. We had every right to make decisions about that money. For my benefit, Marcus said, his voice rising. The money was supposed to benefit me. How does your vacation house benefit me? How does paying for Jenny's private school benefit me? Sarah looked up from her tears. Jenny needed help with school, and your uncle couldn't afford it. We thought you were doing fine on your own. I was doing fine because I had no choice, because you let me believe we were a struggling family. I worked 2 jobs in college because I thought we couldn't afford my education. I ate ramen noodles for months because I thought every dollar mattered. And the whole time, you were living in luxury paid for with my money. David's expression hardened. That money sat in that account for years doing nothing. At least we put it to good use. Good use? Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was supposed to sit there until I turned 28, which is now. It was supposed to grow so I'd have financial security. Instead, you've been using it as your personal piggy bank. Sarah reached across the counter toward Marcus. Sweetheart, please try to understand. We never meant to hurt you. We saw an opportunity to help the family, to give ourselves a better life after so many years of struggling. By stealing from your own son. We're your parents, David exploded. Everything we have is yours eventually anyway. What difference does it make if we use some of it now? Marcus stared at his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in his life. The difference is that it wasn't your choice to make. And the difference is that you let me struggle when you could have helped me. You watched me stress about money for years while you were buying vacation homes with my inheritance. He gathered up the documents and put them back in the folder. The lawyer says I have several options. I can demand immediate restitution, file a civil lawsuit, or pursue criminal charges. Right now, I'm leaning toward all 3. Sarah gasped. You can't be serious. We're your family. Family doesn't steal from each other. And family doesn't lie about it for over a decade. David's face was red with anger now. If you try to come after us legally, we'll fight you every step of the way. We'll tie this up in courts for years. You'll spend more on legal fees than you'll ever recover. The threat hung in the air between them. Marcus looked at his parents, really looked at them, and saw strangers. The people who'd raised him, who'd tucked him in at night and helped with homework, had been systematically betraying him for half his adult life. Then I guess we'll see what happens, Marcus said quietly. He left without another word, driving back to Brooklyn in silence. His phone rang repeatedly, both parents calling, probably hoping to convince him not to take legal action. He let the calls go to voicemail. That evening, Marcus called Morrison's office and scheduled another appointment. When he met with the lawyer the next day, his decision was made. I want to pursue all available options, Marcus told Morrison. Civil lawsuit, criminal charges if appropriate, and I want immediate restitution of all improperly withdrawn funds. Morrison nodded grimly. I have to warn you, Mr. Chen, this won't be easy. Family legal battles rarely are. They'll likely claim that their actions were justified, that they provided for your upbringing and therefore deserved compensation from the trust. Let them try, Marcus said. I have something they don't. What's that? The truth. Over the following weeks, Morrison's investigation revealed the full scope of his parents' deception. They'd not only withdrawn money for personal purchases, but had also failed to file required annual reports, had made risky investments with trust funds that didn't pay off, and had even borrowed against the trust's assets to cover personal debts. The Westchester house had a mortgage that was secured against trust property. The vacation home had been purchased entirely with trust funds, then placed in David and Sarah's names. They'd essentially laundered Marcus's inheritance through real estate transactions to hide their theft. But the discovery that hurt most came when Morrison found records of conversations between his parents and their financial advisor. In emails dating back 5 years, David had written, "Marcus doesn't need to know about the trust yet. He's doing fine on his own, and we could really use the money for the house renovations." Sarah had responded, "I feel terrible about this, but you're right. The money is just sitting there, and Marcus is so independent. He probably won't even want it when he finds out." The casual dismissal of his financial struggles, the assumption that he was doing fine while he scraped by, revealed a level of callousness Marcus hadn't expected from his parents. They hadn't just stolen from him, they'd convinced themselves he didn't deserve what was rightfully his. The civil lawsuit was filed 3 weeks after Marcus's initial meeting with Morrison. His parents immediately hired their own attorney, an expensive firm that Marcus realized they were probably paying for with more of his money. The legal papers arrived at their Westchester house on a Tuesday morning, and within an hour, Marcus's phone was ringing. "How could you do this to us?" Sarah sobbed into the phone. "We're your parents. Family doesn't sue family." "Family doesn't steal from family either," Marcus replied, using the same words he'd spoken in their kitchen. "You made this choice when you decided to take money that wasn't yours." "We raised you," David yelled in the background, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "We deserve something for 28 years of taking care of you." Marcus hung up the phone. Over the next few days, he received dozens of calls and texts from extended family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, all trying to convince him to drop the lawsuit. The family narrative, he learned, was that he was being greedy and ungrateful, that his parents had done nothing wrong, and that he was tearing the family apart over money. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being accused of caring too much about money by the people who'd stolen nearly $1 million from him. His cousin Jenny, whose private school education had been funded by his trust, called him crying. "Marcus, please don't do this. My parents are so worried about Uncle David and Aunt Sarah. They say you're trying to destroy the family." "Jenny, did you know that your private school was paid for with money my grandmother left for me?" There was silence on the other end of the line. I don't understand." Marcus explained the situation as gently as he could. Jenny was only 19, and none of this was her fault, but she deserved to know the truth about how her education had been funded. "I had no idea," Jenny whispered when he finished. "My parents told me Uncle David had gotten a big promotion and wanted to help with school." "It's not your fault, Jenny, and I'm not coming after the money that was spent on your education. But I need you to understand that my parents didn't help you out of generosity. They helped you with money that was stolen from me." The conversation ended with Jenny in tears, and Marcus felt terrible about it. But the truth was the truth, even when it hurt innocent people. As the legal process moved forward, Marcus began to understand the full extent of his parents' financial web. They'd used trust funds as collateral for additional loans, had invested in risky ventures that lost money, and had even begun treating the trust as their personal checking account for everyday expenses. The vacation house in the Hamptons was mortgaged to the hilt, with payments that exceeded David's salary. They'd been using trust funds to make the mortgage payments, essentially forcing Marcus's inheritance to pay for their lifestyle. Morrison estimated that between the improperly withdrawn funds, the lost investment opportunities, and the accumulated interest, Marcus was owed just over $2 million. "The problem," Morrison explained during one of their meetings, "is that your parents don't have $2 million to give you. The houses are heavily mortgaged, and their other investments haven't performed well. If we push for immediate full restitution, they'll likely have to declare bankruptcy." Marcus considered this information carefully. Part of him wanted to see his parents lose everything, to experience the financial stress he'd lived with for years while they enjoyed luxury. But another part of him, the part that still remembered being a child who loved his parents, felt conflicted. "What are my options?" he asked. "We could negotiate a settlement where they surrender the properties to you, and you assume the mortgages. We could set up a payment plan for the remaining funds. Or we could proceed with the full lawsuit and force a judgment, knowing they might not be able to pay." Marcus left the meeting without making a decision. That weekend, he drove out to the Hamptons' house, using the key his parents had given him years earlier when they'd first bought the place. The house was beautiful. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a deck that looked out over the dunes toward the ocean. It was the kind of place Marcus had dreamed of owning someday when he was more established in his career and could afford such luxuries. Walking through the rooms, he imagined his grandmother, the woman who'd worked 14-hour days in her alterations shop so that her grandson could have opportunities she'd never had. She'd saved every penny, invested wisely, and planned carefully to leave him something meaningful. And his parents had treated her legacy like their personal reward for raising him. There were no photos of him in the house. He'd only visited a few times, and always briefly. This wasn't a family vacation home. It was his parents' private retreat, paid for with his money. That night, Marcus called Morrison and made his decision. "I want full restitution, but I'm willing to negotiate the terms. They can surrender both houses to me, and I'll assume the mortgages. For the remaining funds they owe, we'll set up a payment plan. But I want them to admit what they did. No claiming it was justified or legal. I want a written admission that they breached their fiduciary duty and improperly used trust funds." Morrison smiled grimly. "That's going to be the hardest part. Admitting wrongdoing opens them up to potential criminal charges. Then they should have thought of that before they stole from me." The negotiations took 2 months. Marcus's parents fought every aspect of the settlement, particularly the admission of wrongdoing. Their lawyer argued that they'd acted in good faith as trustees, that they'd raised Marcus and deserved compensation, that the trust language was ambiguous about what constituted benefit to the beneficiary. But Morrison had done his homework. He'd found case law, precedent, and clear legal standards that demolished every argument. More damaging still, he'd uncovered email communications between David and Sarah discussing how to hide their withdrawals from the trust, how to make it look like the money was being used for Marcus's benefit when it clearly wasn't. In one particularly damning exchange, David had written to Sarah, "We need to be more careful about the paper trail. If Marcus ever finds out about the trust before we're ready, we could be in real trouble." Sarah had responded, "Maybe we should tell him soon. I feel terrible lying to him about our finances." David's reply, "Not yet. Let's get a few more years out of this, then we'll figure out how to explain it." The emails painted a picture of deliberate deception, not good faith trustee decisions. When confronted with this evidence, Marcus's parents' lawyer advised them to settle. The final agreement was signed on a cold January morning in Morrison's conference room. Marcus sat across from his parents, who looked older and more fragile than he remembered. They signed document after document, transferring the deeds to both houses, setting up a payment plan for the remaining funds, and, most painfully, admitting in writing that they had improperly used trust funds for their personal benefit in violation of their fiduciary duties. Sarah cried through most of the signing. David sat stone-faced, occasionally glaring at Marcus as if this were all his fault. When the last document was signed, David stood up abruptly. "I hope you're happy," he said bitterly. "You've destroyed this family over money." Marcus looked at his father steadily. "I didn't destroy anything, Dad. You did that when you decided to steal from your own son." David started to respond, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Let's just go," she whispered. They left without saying goodbye. Morrison walked Marcus to the elevator after his parents had gone. "How do you feel?" the lawyer asked. Marcus considered the question. "Hollow," he finally answered. "I got my money back, but I lost my parents in the process." "You didn't lose them," Morrison said gently. "You just found out who they really were." Over the following months, Marcus began the process of rebuilding his understanding of himself and his family. The Westchester house sold quickly, and the proceeds helped pay down the amount his parents owed. the Hamptons house he kept, spending weekends there when the weather was nice, trying to make new memories in a place that had been purchased with lies. He paid off his student loans in full, a moment he dreamed about for years, but that now felt anticlimactic. The debt that had stressed him for so long disappeared with a few mouse clicks, erased by money that should have been available to him all along. The hardest part was the silence. His parents didn't call, didn't text, didn't reach out in any way. When Marcus drove past their old apartment building in Queens, he felt a profound sadness for the simple life they had all shared there, before money and deception had complicated everything. Extended family members occasionally reached out, usually to suggest that Marcus should reconcile with his parents, that family was more important than money. Marcus tried to explain that this wasn't about money. It was about trust, about honesty, about the fact that his parents had let him struggle financially while living comfortably on his inheritance. But most people seemed to think he was being stubborn and unforgiving. His cousin Jenny was the exception. She'd transferred to a state school after learning how her education had been funded, despite Marcus telling her it wasn't necessary. "I can't enjoy something that was paid for with your money. It doesn't feel right." 6 months after the settlement, Marcus received a letter with no return address. Inside was a short note in his mother's handwriting. "We know we hurt you, and we're sorry. We miss you every day. Love, Mom and Dad." Marcus read the note several times, then put it in his desk drawer. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was something. Maybe someday it would be the beginning of a conversation. Maybe not. On the first anniversary of receiving Morrison's letter, Marcus drove to the cemetery where his grandmother was buried. He'd never visited her grave before, something that now filled him with regret. The headstone was simple. Eleanor Chen, beloved mother and grandmother, 1924 to 1995. Marcus knelt beside the grave and spoke out loud for the first time in months about everything that had happened. He told his grandmother about the trust, about what his parents had done, about the legal battle and the settlement. He thanked her for her foresight and her sacrifice, for working so hard to provide opportunities for a grandson she'd barely had time to know. "I'm going to make sure your money does what you wanted it to do. I'm going to build something meaningful with it. I'm going to make you proud." As he drove home from the cemetery, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness, exactly, but a sense of resolution. He'd discovered the truth about his family, fought for what was rightfully his, and emerged with his integrity intact. The money was nice, but the real victory was knowing he'd stood up for himself and for his grandmother's wishes. The trust fund betrayal had cost him his relationship with his parents, at least for now. But it had also taught him something valuable about the difference between family and people who happen to share your DNA.
Real family, he'd learned, doesn't steal from each other. Real family doesn't lie about it for decades. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is walk away from people who hurt you, even when they're supposed to love you most. Marcus Chen had thought he understood his place in the world. Turns out, he'd been wrong about almost everything. But now, finally, he was exactly where he belonged. The weeks following the settlement brought an unexpected emptiness that Marcus hadn't anticipated. He'd imagined that winning would feel triumphant, that justice would bring satisfaction. Instead, he found himself sitting in his Brooklyn studio apartment, staring at bank statements that showed more money than he'd ever dreamed of having, feeling profoundly alone. The Hamptons house stood empty most weekends. Marcus had driven out there twice since taking ownership, but each visit felt like walking through a museum of someone else's life. The furniture his parents had chosen, the decorations they'd selected, the memories they'd made, all of it felt tainted by the knowledge of how it had been purchased. On a rainy Thursday evening in February, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from his father's brother, Uncle Tom. They hadn't spoken since the lawsuit became public knowledge within the family, and Marcus had assumed Tom had written him off along with the rest of the relatives who'd taken his parents' side. "Marcus, I know you probably don't want to hear from me." Tom's voice was hesitant, uncertain. "But I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Marcus sat down at Chinese takeout he'd been eating and gave his full attention to the call. "What is it, Uncle Tom?" I knew about the trust. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His uncle had known. Another family member who'd watched him struggle while knowing the truth about his inheritance. I didn't know the details, Tom continued quickly, as if sensing Marcus's reaction, but I knew your grandmother had left money for you. Your father mentioned it years ago, said they were managing it until you were older. I assumed they were doing right by you. Marcus felt his anger building again, the same fury that had sustained him through months of legal battles. You knew, and you never said anything. I didn't think it was my place. Your parents were the trustees. I figured they knew what they were doing. But after everything that's come out, after seeing what they actually did with that money, Marcus, I'm ashamed that I didn't speak up. The admission hung between them in the silence. Marcus appreciated his uncle's honesty, but it only reinforced how isolated he'd been, how many people had possessed pieces of the truth while he'd lived in ignorance. There's something else, Tom continued. Jenny wants to see you. She's been asking about you constantly since everything happened. She feels terrible about the private school situation. Marcus sighed. His cousin Jenny had been collateral damage in the whole situation, an innocent beneficiary of stolen money who'd had no knowledge of its source. He'd been meaning to reach out to her, but hadn't known what to say. She could come to the city this weekend if you're willing to meet. No pressure, but I think it would mean a lot to her. Marcus agreed to the meeting more out of curiosity than any real desire for family reconciliation. Jenny had always been a sweet kid, and if she was genuinely struggling with the situation, he felt obligated to help her process it. They met at a small cafe in Greenwich Village on Saturday afternoon. Jenny looked older than her 19 years, her face drawn with stress and guilt. She hugged Marcus tightly when she saw him, and he could feel her trembling. I can't stop thinking about it, she said once they'd ordered coffee. Every class I took, every book I bought, every opportunity I had at that school, it was all paid for with money that belonged to you. I feel like such a fraud. Marcus studied his cousin's face, seeing genuine anguish there. Jenny, you were a kid. You had no way of knowing where the money came from. None of this is your fault. But I benefited from it, she insisted. I got opportunities that should have been yours. The private school, the college prep classes, the SAT tutoring, all of it gave me advantages I never would have had otherwise. And what do you want to do about that? Jenny pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse and slid it across the table. I've been working 2 jobs since I transferred to state school. I've saved up $3,000 so far. I want to pay you back, even if it takes me years. Marcus looked at the paper, a handwritten IOU promising to repay the full cost of her private school education, estimated at $45,000. The gesture was touching, but unnecessary. Jenny, I can't take your money. You didn't steal from me. My parents did. But I was the one who benefited, she argued. If I don't try to make this right, how am I any different from them? The question revealed a maturity that impressed Marcus. Jenny understood something that many of their family members didn't, that benefiting from theft, even unknowingly, created a moral obligation to make amends.
That's actually a really good idea. I could tutor kids for free or help with college application essays. Turn the stolen opportunity into something positive. They spent the next hour discussing possibilities, and Marcus felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in months. Here was a family member who understood the complexity of the situation, who wanted to do the right thing even when it was difficult. It gave him hope that not all of his family relationships were irreparably damaged. As they prepared to leave, Jenny hesitated. Marcus, can I ask you something? Do you think you'll ever forgive Uncle David and Aunt Sarah? The question had been haunting Marcus for months. In quiet moments, he found himself missing his parents, despite everything they'd done. He missed their phone calls, their visits, the sense of family connection that had been severed by their betrayal. I don't know, he answered honestly. Part of me wants to forgive them, but forgiveness feels like it requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing, genuine remorse, and a commitment to change. I haven't seen any of that from them. Jenny nodded thoughtfully. They're still telling people they did nothing wrong. Dad says Uncle David is convinced you'll come around eventually, that you'll realize family is more important than money.
The comment stung because it revealed his parents' continued refusal to understand what had really happened. They were still framing the situation as Marcus choosing money over family, rather than acknowledging that they had chosen their own financial benefit over their son's trust and well-being. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment reviewing the financial documents Morrison had given him during their final meeting. The trust investment history showed how much money he'd lost due to his parents' mismanagement. Beyond the direct withdrawals, they'd made poor investment decisions with the remaining funds, choosing high-risk ventures that had cost the trust hundreds of thousands of dollars. One investment particularly caught his attention: a failed restaurant venture that his father had put $50,000 of trust money into without any documentation or oversight. The restaurant had closed within 6 months, and the entire investment had been lost. Marcus remembered his father mentioning the restaurant casually, describing it as a business opportunity with some friends. He'd never mentioned that the investment was made with Marcus's money. The more Marcus studied the records, the clearer it became that his parents had treated the trust as their personal investment fund, making risky bets with money that wasn't theirs to lose. The arrogance of it astounded him. Not only had they stolen from him, they'd gambled with his future on ventures they would never have risked their own money on. His phone rang, interrupting his review of the documents. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something prompted him to answer. "Marcus? This is Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell. I was your grandmother's doctor during her final years." Marcus sat up straighter, intrigued by this unexpected connection to his grandmother. "Dr. Hartwell? How did you get my number?" "I saw an article in the legal newsletter about the trust case. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, and I wanted you to know some things about her that your parents may never have told you." Over the next hour, Dr. Hartwell painted a picture of Eleanor Chen that was far richer than the simple immigrant story Marcus had grown up hearing. His grandmother had been incredibly sharp and business-minded, carefully planning every aspect of her financial legacy. She'd spoken often about Marcus, expressing hopes for his future and concerns about ensuring he would have opportunities she'd never had. "She was very specific about the trust," Dr. Hartwell explained. "She wanted you to have financial security, but she also wanted you to understand the value of work and struggle. That's why she structured it to be released when you were 28, old enough to appreciate what she'd built." "Did she ever express concerns about my parents managing the money?" There was a pause. "She did, actually. She worried that David might be tempted to use the funds inappropriately. She considered naming a bank as trustee instead, but ultimately decided that family should handle family business. I think she would be heartbroken to know what happened." The conversation left Marcus feeling both connected to his grandmother and angry about what had been stolen from him. Not just money, but the opportunity to understand her better, to appreciate her sacrifice while she was still alive, to see his gratitude. The next week brought another unexpected development. Marcus received a call from Morrison with news that his parents were attempting to challenge the settlement agreement, claiming they'd been coerced to signing and that the terms were unfair. They're arguing that the payment plan is too aggressive and that forcing them to surrender the houses was punitive rather than restitutional. Their new lawyer is pushing for a modification of the agreement. Marcus felt his carefully controlled anger flare again. Even after admitting wrongdoing and signing a settlement, his parents were still trying to avoid the consequences of their actions. Can they do that? Can they just decide they don't like the deal they agreed to? They can try, but they don't have much of a case. The settlement was negotiated over months, they had legal representation, and the terms were reasonable given the scope of their theft. But it will mean more legal proceedings, more time, and more money spent on attorneys. Marcus made the decision quickly. Fight it. I'm not letting them weasel out of this agreement. They signed it, and they're going to honor it. The challenge to the settlement dragged on for 3 months, during which Marcus's parents made no payments under the agreed-upon plan, claiming the ongoing legal dispute excused their obligations. Marcus watched his legal bills mount while his parents lived in the Westchester house they were supposed to have surrendered, driving cars they'd purchased with his money, maintaining a lifestyle funded by theft. The breaking point came when Marcus learned that his parents had taken out a second mortgage on the Westchester house, using the proceeds to fund their legal challenge. They were literally borrowing against property that was supposed to be his to pay lawyers to avoid giving it to him.
Morrison's motion to enforce the original settlement was heard on a sweltering Tuesday in July. Marcus sat in the courtroom watching his parents' lawyer argue that the settlement was unconscionable, that his clients were emotional and not thinking clearly when they signed it, and that the terms would leave them financially destitute. The judge was not sympathetic. Mr. and Mrs. Chen entered into the settlement after months of negotiation with experienced legal counsel. They admitted to breaching their fiduciary duties as trustees. The terms of the settlement are reasonable given the circumstances. Motion to modify is denied. The defendants have 30 days to comply with the original agreement or face contempt of court proceedings. Marcus felt a grim satisfaction as his parents and their lawyer filed out of the courtroom. Justice was slow, but it was finally arriving.
The compliance deadline came and went without any action from his parents. True to his word, Morrison filed contempt motions, and a hearing was scheduled for the following month. The possibility of jail time for his parents loomed, and Marcus found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to see them face serious consequences for their actions. They'd stolen from him, lied about it for years, and then tried to avoid accountability even after being caught. But another part of him, the part that remembered being a child who loved his parents unconditionally, recoiled at the thought of them in prison. The night before the contempt hearing, Marcus received a call that changed everything. It was his mother, the first time they'd spoken since the settlement signing. "Marcus, please." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "We'll comply with the agreement. We'll sign over the houses. We'll start making payments. Just please don't let them put us in jail." The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking, but Marcus forced himself to remain steady. "Mom, you had months to comply. You chose to fight it instead." "We were scared. We didn't know what else to do. David thought maybe we could get better terms, but I knew it was wrong. I knew we should have just accepted what we agreed to." "So? Why didn't you?" There was a long pause. "Because accepting it meant admitting we were terrible parents. It meant admitting we stole from our own son, and I wasn't ready to face that." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Marcus heard something like genuine remorse in his mother's voice. Not self-pity, not justification, but actual acknowledgement of wrongdoing. "What changed?" he asked. The lawyer explained what contempt of court means. 60 days in jail, maybe more. And I realized that I'd rather admit the truth than go to prison for it. I'd rather face what we did than keep lying about it. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of him. He could insist on the contempt proceedings, watch his parents face jail time for their continued defiance. Or he could accept their compliance now, knowing they were only doing it to avoid prison. "The houses and all property need to be transferred within the week," he said finally. "The payment plan starts immediately, and if you miss even one payment, we're back in court." "And Mom?" "Yes?" "I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this because I forgive you. I'm doing this because I don't want to see you in jail. But the trust between us is gone. You're going to have to live with that." Sarah was crying softly. "I know. I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry." Marcus hung up without saying goodbye. The next morning, he called Morrison and agreed to accept his parents' compliance rather than pursue the contempt proceedings. The lawyer warned him that showing mercy might be perceived as weakness, but Marcus was tired of fighting. He wanted his money back and his life back, not revenge. The property transfers were completed the following Friday. Marcus stood in the lobby of Morrison's office as his parents signed deed after deed, transferring ownership of the houses that had been purchased with his inheritance. They looked older and more fragile than he remembered, worn down by months of legal stress and the weight of their own choices. When the signing was complete, David looked up at Marcus for the first time since they'd entered the office. "I want you to know that everything we did because we thought we were providing for the family. We never meant to hurt you." Marcus met his father's gaze steadily. "Dad, you had nearly $1 million that belonged to me. You could have helped me with college, with student loans, with getting started in life. Instead, you bought vacation homes and luxury cars. That's not providing for family. That's providing for yourselves." David's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Just don't." They left without another word, and Marcus watched them walk away, wondering if he would ever see them again.
The Westchester house sold within a month, and the proceeds, combined with his parents' first few payments under the settlement plan, brought Marcus's recovered funds to just over $1 million. It wasn't the full $2 million he was owed, but it was substantial enough to transform his life completely. Marcus left his job at the software company and started his own consulting firm, using his grandmother's money to provide the financial security needed to take entrepreneurial risks. He moved out of his small Brooklyn studio and bought a modest two-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. Nothing extravagant, but comfortable and his own. The Hamptons house remained a challenge. Marcus tried spending weekends there, but the memories of his parents' deception permeated every room. Finally, he decided to renovate completely, stripping away all traces of his parents' presence and making it truly his own space. As he stood in the gutted living room one Saturday morning, directing contractors and planning the renovation, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in over a year: genuine excitement about the future. The house would become his retreat, a place where he could think and work and build something meaningful with the legacy his grandmother had left him. The money was nice, but the real inheritance was the knowledge that he could stand up for himself, that he didn't have to accept betrayal simply because it came from family, and that sometimes the hardest thing to do, walking away from people who hurt you, is also the right thing to do. Marcus Chen had lost his parents, but found himself. And as he planned the renovation of his new home, he felt genuinely hopeful for the future for the first time in over a year. 2 years after the settlement, Marcus Chen stood in his renovated Hamptons home, watching the sunrise paint the Atlantic Ocean in shades of gold and pink. The house bore no resemblance to the place his parents had furnished with stolen money.
Every room had been gutted and rebuilt according to his vision. Every piece of furniture chosen by him. Every decoration a reflection of his own taste rather than theirs. The consulting firm he'd started with his grandmother's money had grown beyond his wildest expectations. What had begun as a one-man operation focused on helping small businesses optimize their software systems had evolved into a team of 12 consultants serving clients across the Northeast. The financial security provided by his inheritance had allowed him to take calculated risks, to turn down projects that didn't align with his values, and to build something meaningful rather than just profitable. On this particular morning, Marcus was preparing for a meeting that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. His parents had requested to see him, their first attempt at contact since the contempt hearing that had finally forced them to comply with the settlement agreement. The request had come through Morrison's office, formal and cautious, asking if Marcus would be willing to meet for coffee to discuss family matters. Marcus had initially dismissed the idea. What could they possibly have to say that would matter now? They'd made their choices, faced the consequences, and everyone had moved on. But something about the formal tone of the request, so different from their previous angry demands and manipulative pleading, had intrigued him enough to agree. The coffee shop they'd chosen was neutral territory, a small place in White Plains, halfway between Marcus's Manhattan apartment and whatever residence his parents had found after losing the Westchester house. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, wanting the psychological advantage of being settled and comfortable when they walked in. He almost didn't recognize them at first. David and Sarah Chen looked like they'd aged a decade in the 2 years since he'd last seen them. His father's hair had gone completely gray, and he moved with the careful gait of someone whose confidence had been shattered. His mother appeared smaller somehow, dressed in clothes that were clean but clearly inexpensive, a far cry from the designer outfits she'd worn during their years of living on stolen money. They sat across from him in the cramped coffee shop booth, and for several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Thank you for agreeing to see us. We weren't sure you would." Marcus studied his mother's face, looking for signs of the manipulation that had characterized so many of their previous interactions. Instead, he saw something he'd never seen before: genuine humility. "What did you want to discuss?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. David cleared his throat nervously. "We wanted to apologize. Really apologize. Not the defensive justifications we gave you before. We've had a lot of time to think about what we did, and we understand now that it was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong." The words hung in the air between them. Marcus had dreamed of hearing his parents admit their wrongdoing without qualification, but now that it was happening, he felt oddly detached from it. "What changed?" he asked. Sarah looked down at her hands. Losing everything, having to start over at our age, facing the reality that we'd destroyed our relationship with our son for money that wasn't ours to begin with. It took losing everything for us to see what we'd really lost. We've been in therapy, individual and couples therapy, trying to understand how we could have convinced ourselves that what we were doing was okay, how we could have rationalized stealing from you. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And what did you discover?" "That we felt entitled," Sarah said quietly. "We felt like we'd sacrificed so much raising you, like we deserved something in return. When your grandmother's money became available, we told ourselves we were just taking what we'd earned. But that was a lie. We were stealing from you, and we knew it." David nodded, his face heavy with shame. "The therapy helped us understand that we were angry that your grandmother left the money to you instead of us. Angry that we'd struggled financially while she had all that wealth. Angry that we had to wait until you were 28 to see any benefit from it. But anger doesn't justify theft." Marcus listened to their admissions with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. These were the words he'd wanted to hear 2 years ago, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing that might have made reconciliation possible. Now hearing them felt hollow, like rain after a drought had already killed the crops. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because we owe you the truth," Sarah replied, "and because we want you to know that we understand what we lost. We didn't just steal money from you, we stole your trust, your respect, your love. We turned ourselves from your parents into strangers who hurt you." David leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We're not asking for forgiveness, Marcus. We know we don't deserve it. We just wanted you to know that we finally understand what we did, and we're sorry, truly, deeply sorry." The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus asking questions and his parents providing answers that seemed honest and thoughtful. They told him about the apartment they now rented in Yonkers, about David's job at a small accounting firm that paid a fraction of what he'd earned before, about the financial stress of making payments on the settlement while living on a dramatically reduced income. They asked about his business, his life, his happiness, and seemed genuinely interested in his answers rather than looking for ammunition for future manipulation. When Marcus mentioned the tutoring program Jenny had started, Sarah smiled for the first time during the meeting. "She's a good kid. We're proud of what she's doing, and we're glad you two have maintained a relationship." As the meeting wound down, Marcus felt an unexpected emotion. Pity. Not forgiveness, not love, but a kind of sad compassion for two people who had destroyed their lives through greed and selfishness. They seemed genuinely remorseful, but the damage they'd caused couldn't be undone with apologies and therapy sessions. "I appreciate you coming here today," Marcus said as they prepared to leave, "and I appreciate the apology, but I need you to understand that this doesn't change anything between us. I'm glad you're working on yourselves, but I've moved on from having you in my life." Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. "We understand. We just wanted you to know that we finally get it. We finally understand what we threw away."
They left the coffee shop separately, and Marcus sat alone for several minutes, processing the encounter. His parents' apology had been everything he'd wanted to hear 2 years ago, but it had come too late. The person who might have been moved by their words, who might have found a path back to family reconciliation, no longer existed. That person had been killed by their betrayal, and the man who remained had built a life that didn't include them. Driving back to Manhattan, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that first letter from Morrison's office. The financial transformation was obvious. He now had more money than he'd ever imagined possible, along with the security and freedom that came with it. But the personal transformation was deeper and more significant. He'd learned to trust his own judgment over family loyalty. He'd learned that love without respect was worthless, that forgiveness without accountability was meaningless, and that sometimes walking away from toxic people was the healthiest choice, even when those people were family. The consulting business had become more than just a career. It had become a mission.
Marcus specialized in helping family-owned businesses navigate succession planning and financial transparency, using the lessons learned from his own family's dysfunction to help others avoid similar pitfalls. His personal experience with betrayal and legal battles had given him insights that traditional business consultants couldn't provide. One of his clients, a third-generation restaurant chain, had been struggling with similar issues of trust and financial management between family members. The founder's son had been siphoning money from the business to fund personal investments, using his position as CFO to hide the theft from his father and siblings. Marcus had helped them implement oversight systems and accountability measures that preserve the family business while addressing the betrayal. "You understand this in a way other consultants don't," the restaurant owner had told him. "You've lived through family betrayal, and you know how to protect against it without destroying the relationships that can be saved." Marcus had built a reputation in this niche, becoming known as the consultant who could help families navigate the intersection of money and relationships. It was meaningful work that turned his painful experience into something valuable for others. The Hamptons house had become his sanctuary, a place where he could work in peace and entertain friends without the baggage of his family's deception. He'd hosted several gatherings there, including a summer barbecue for his consulting team and a weekend retreat for Jenny and some of her college friends who were working on their tutoring program. Jenny had blossomed in the years since the trust fund revelation. Her tutoring program had expanded to serve over 30 low-income students annually, helping them navigate college applications and scholarship opportunities. She'd secured grants from local foundations and had been featured in the local newspaper for her work. The guilt she'd initially felt about benefiting from stolen money had transformed into a powerful motivation to help others. "I think about grandmother Eleanor a lot when I'm working with these kids," Jenny had told Marcus during her last visit to the Hamptons house. "She would have understood their struggles, their dreams of something better. In a weird way, what Uncle David and Aunt Sarah did wrong, we're trying to make right." Marcus had been proud of his cousin's growth and grateful for the relationship they'd maintained. Jenny represented the possibility that family connections could survive even the worst betrayals, as long as both parties were committed to honesty and accountability. The one aspect of his transformation that Marcus hadn't fully anticipated was the dating challenges that came with his new financial situation. He'd always been cautious about relationships, but having significant money had added layers of complexity he hadn't expected. He found himself questioning whether people were interested in him or his wealth, whether their affection was genuine or calculated. He dated several women over the past 2 years, but none of the relationships had developed into anything serious. The trust issues created by his parents' betrayal seemed to extend beyond family relationships, making him hyper-vigilant about people's motivations and overly suspicious of anyone who showed interest in his lifestyle or financial situation. His therapist, Dr. Rebecca Torres, had helped him understand that his hypervigilance was a natural response to betrayal trauma, but that it could become a barrier to forming healthy relationships if he didn't learn to manage it. "Your parents' betrayal taught you that people you trust completely can hurt you deeply," Dr. Torres had explained during one of their sessions. "That's a valuable lesson in appropriate caution, but it becomes problematic when it prevents you from trusting anyone at all." Marcus had been working on finding the balance between prudent caution and paranoid isolation. He'd started volunteering with a local organization that provided financial literacy education to young adults aging out of foster care, work that felt meaningful and connected him with people who shared his values rather than his wealth. It was through this volunteer work that Marcus met Dr. Amanda Reyes, a social worker who ran workshops on life skills for the same population. Amanda was smart, compassionate, and completely unimpressed by Marcus's money. She drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, lived in a modest apartment in Queens, and seemed more interested in his thoughts on helping vulnerable young people than in his business success or real estate holdings. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared values and genuine compatibility rather than physical attraction or financial considerations. Amanda knew about Marcus's family situation. He'd been honest about it from early in their relationship, but she understood it as one part of his history rather than the defining feature of his identity. "You've turned a terrible experience into something that helps other people," she had told him during one of their conversations about his consulting work. "A lot of people would have just taken the money and tried to forget what happened."
Amanda's perspective helped Marcus see his story differently. Instead of viewing himself primarily as a victim of betrayal, he began to see himself as someone who had fought for justice and used his experience to help others. The shift in self-perception was subtle but significant, moving him from a position of angry defensiveness to one of confident purpose. On a crisp October morning, exactly 3 years after receiving Morrison's first letter, Marcus stood in his Manhattan office, reviewing the financial statements for his consulting firm. The business had grown to the point where he was considering opening a second office in Boston, expanding his services to help more families navigate the complex intersection of money and relationships. His assistant knocked on the door and entered with a familiar-looking envelope. "This came by messenger, Mr. Chen. The delivery service said it was urgent." Marcus recognized the letterhead immediately: Morrison, Keller Associates. His first thought was that his parents had violated the settlement agreement somehow, missed payments, or tried to challenge the terms again, but when he opened the letter, he found something entirely different. "Dear Mr. Chen, we are writing to inform you of a development in your grandmother's estate that has recently come to light. During our review of historical documents related to the Eleanor Chen Memorial Trust, we discovered evidence of an additional asset that was not included in the original trust documentation." Marcus read the sentence twice before continuing. "Your grandmother owned a small commercial property in Brooklyn that was purchased in 1987 and held in a separate legal entity. The property was recently sold by the city for unpaid taxes, but our investigation revealed that the sale was improper due to clerical errors in the tax department's records. The property should have been included in your grandmother's estate, and as her sole heir, you are entitled to claim ownership." Marcus set down the letter and laughed, not with humor, but with amazement at the continuing revelations about his grandmother's legacy. Even 3 years after discovering the trust, Eleanor Chen was still providing for her grandson's future. He called Morrison's office immediately and scheduled a meeting that afternoon. As he prepared to leave his office, Marcus felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and determination. There would be another legal battle, more paperwork, more complications. But there would also be another opportunity to honor his grandmother's memory and secure the legacy she had worked so hard to build. Walking through Manhattan towards Morrison's office, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The trust fund betrayal was devastating, but it had also been transformative. He'd lost his parents, but gained a clear understanding of his own values. He'd lost the illusion of family harmony, but gained the reality of financial security and meaningful work. The person he had become was stronger, wiser, and more purposeful than the person he had been before discovering the truth about his inheritance. He'd fought for what was right, to trust carefully but not cynically, and to build a life based on his own values rather than others' expectations. As he entered Morrison's office building and rode the elevator to the 32nd floor, Marcus felt grateful for the painful journey that had brought him here. His grandmother's money had been stolen, but her true legacy, the lesson that hard work and careful planning could create opportunities for future generations, had been preserved. The additional property would be another battle, another test of his resolve and his commitment to honoring Eleanor Chen's memory.
But Marcus Chen was ready for whatever came next. He'd learned that justice was worth fighting for, that family loyalty had limits, and that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was refusing to enable their worst behavior. Standing in the familiar conference room where his journey had begun 3 years earlier, Marcus felt a deep sense of completion. Not because the story was over. There would always be new challenges, new opportunities, new battles to fight, but because he finally understood who he was and what he stood for. He was Eleanor Chen's grandson, a man who honored his family's legacy not through blind loyalty but through principled action. He was someone who had been betrayed but had refused to become bitter, who had been hurt but had chosen to heal, who had been given wealth but had used it wisely. The trust fund betrayal had nearly destroyed him, but ultimately it had made him whole. And as he prepared for whatever revelations Morrison was about to share, Marcus Chen felt ready for anything. The Brooklyn property that had belonged to Marcus's grandmother sat on a corner lot in Sunset Park, a neighborhood that had transformed dramatically since Eleanor Chen had purchased the building in 1987. What had once been an area of struggling immigrants and industrial warehouses was now a thriving community of young professionals, artists, and families drawn by relatively affordable housing and easy access to Manhattan.
Marcus stood across the street from the three-story brick building, studying its facade and trying to imagine his grandmother working there every day for decades. The ground floor had clearly been retail space, with large windows that would have displayed her alterations business to passing pedestrians. The upper floors appeared to be residential apartments, probably rented out to provide additional income. Morrison had done his research thoroughly. The building had been improperly seized by the city 3 years earlier for what the tax department claimed were unpaid property taxes dating back to 2018. However, the records showed that Eleanor Chen's estate had been paying the taxes through an automated bank transfer that had continued even after her death, managed by a trust account that was separate from the one Marcus's parents had controlled. The error had occurred when the city updated its computer systems and failed to properly transfer the automatic payment information. The bank had continued making payments, but they weren't being credited to the correct account. After 2 years of this bureaucratic confusion, the city had declared the property delinquent and sold it at auction for $180,000 to a developer who planned to renovate it into luxury condominiums. The good news, Morrison had explained during their meeting, is that we have clear documentation showing the taxes were paid. The city made a mistake, and they're legally obligated to correct it. The bad news is that the current owner has already invested significant money in renovations, and they're not going to give up the property without a fight. Marcus had hired Morrison to pursue the case aggressively. The principle mattered more than the money at this point. His grandmother had worked hard to build her portfolio of properties, and he wasn't going to let bureaucratic incompetence steal part of her legacy. The legal process had taken 8 months of documentation, hearings, and negotiations. The city eventually acknowledged their error and agreed to compensate Marcus for the wrongful sale, but determining the appropriate compensation had been complicated. The developer who'd purchased the property had already spent $200,000 on renovations and was demanding to be made whole for his investment. The final settlement had been reached just 2 weeks earlier. Marcus would receive $425,000 from the city, the current appraised value of the property, minus the developer's renovation costs. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was fair compensation for the city's mistake. Standing on the sidewalk looking at the building, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions. This was where his grandmother had spent her working life, serving the neighborhood's residents who needed clothing altered or repaired. She'd built her wealth not through luck or inheritance, but through decades of careful work and smart investments. Every dollar she'd saved had been earned through her own labor. A young woman emerged from the building carrying a coffee cup and a laptop bag, clearly one of the new residents attracted to the area's growing reputation as an affordable alternative to more expensive Brooklyn neighborhoods. She looked like she belonged to the generation that took gentrification for granted, probably unaware that the building she lived in had once housed an immigrant woman's dreams of providing for her grandson's future. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. "How does it feel being back there?" He typed back, "Complicated. Proud of her, angry about what was lost, grateful for what was recovered." Amanda understood the emotional complexity of his relationship with his grandmother's legacy. She'd listened to him work through his feelings about inheriting money from someone he'd barely known, about the responsibility of honoring a legacy he hadn't fully understood until it was nearly stolen from him. Over the past year, Marcus and Amanda's relationship had deepened into something serious and stable. She'd moved into his Manhattan apartment 6 months earlier, bringing her practical sensibility and social worker's perspective to balance his entrepreneur's ambition and inherited wealth. They talked about marriage, about children, about building a life together that honored both of their values. Amanda had suggested that Marcus do something meaningful with the additional money from the Brooklyn property settlement, something that would connect him more directly to his grandmother's memory and the neighborhood where she'd worked. The idea had been percolating in his mind for weeks, and standing here, looking at the building where Eleanor Chen had built her American dream, he knew what he wanted to do. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Jenny, who was now in her senior year at SUNY Purchase, studying social work, inspired by her tutoring experiences to pursue a career helping underserved communities. "Marcus, how did the property visit go?" "It was emotional, but in a good way. I wanted to run an idea by you. What would you think about starting a nonprofit organization focused on financial literacy and small business development for immigrants and first-generation Americans?"
There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Jenny's excited voice. "Oh my God, that's perfect! It's exactly what grandmother Eleanor would have wanted, helping people build the kind of financial security she created for herself." They spent the next hour discussing possibilities. Marcus had the capital to fund the organization's startup costs. Jenny had the passion and increasingly relevant education to help design programs. And Amanda had the professional connections in the social services world to identify partner organizations and potential clients. The more they talked, the more excited Marcus became about the project. It would be a way to honor his grandmother's memory while addressing the kinds of financial vulnerabilities that had made her own journey so difficult. Immigrants and first-generation Americans often lacked access to traditional financial services and business development resources, forcing them to navigate complex systems without guidance or support. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into researching and planning the nonprofit organization. He met with directors of similar organizations in other cities, consulted with financial advisors who specialized in serving immigrant communities, and worked with lawyers to establish the legal structure for what would become the Eleanor Chen Foundation. The foundation's mission statement reflected both his grandmother's values and his own hard-earned understanding of financial vulnerability. To provide financial education, business development support, and advocacy services to immigrants and first-generation Americans, helping them build economic security and generational wealth. Marcus decided to locate the foundation's offices in Sunset Park, not far from where his grandmother's alterations business had operated. The symbolism felt important. Eleanor Chen's grandson returning to her neighborhood to continue the work of helping immigrants achieve financial stability and success. The space he found was a renovated warehouse that had been converted into affordable office space for nonprofits and small businesses. The rent was reasonable, the location was accessible by public transportation, and the building housed several other organizations serving immigrant communities, creating opportunities for collaboration and resource sharing. Jenny agreed to join the foundation as program coordinator after her graduation, bringing her tutoring experience and social work training to help design educational programs. Amanda remained in her job with the city's social services department, but agreed to serve on the foundation's board of directors, providing oversight and strategic guidance. The first program Marcus developed was a financial literacy workshop series offered in multiple languages, covering topics like banking, credit, saving for emergencies, and understanding taxes. The workshops were designed to be practical and accessible, addressing the specific challenges faced by people who might be unfamiliar with American financial institutions or wary of government agencies. The second program focused on small business development, providing training and mentorship for immigrants who wanted to start their own businesses. Marcus drew on his consulting experience to create curricula covering business planning, legal compliance, marketing, and financial management. The program included a microloan fund that would provide small amounts of capital to help participants launch their ventures. The foundation's third initiative was an advocacy program that would help immigrants navigate disputes with financial institutions, landlords, employers, and government agencies. Marcus had learned through his own legal battles how important it was to have knowledgeable advocates when facing complex bureaucratic systems. The Eleanor Chen Foundation officially launched on a sunny Saturday morning in September, exactly 4 years after Marcus had first learned about his grandmother's trust fund. The opening event was held in the foundation's new offices, with representatives from partner organizations, local elected officials, and members of the immigrant communities they planned to serve. Marcus had prepared remarks for the event, but standing at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd of people who had come to learn about the foundation's work, he felt overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. This room full of people represented the culmination of everything he'd learned about family, money, trust, and justice over the past 4 years. "My grandmother Eleanor Chen came to this country with very little," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. She worked hard.
Marcus went on to describe the foundation's programs and vision, but he could see that the audience was most engaged when he talked about his personal experience. His story of betrayal and recovery resonated with people who understood vulnerability, who had faced their own battles with systems designed to exclude or exploit them. After the formal presentation, Marcus spent an hour talking with community members who were interested in the foundation's services. He met a woman from Guatemala who cleaned office buildings at night and wanted to start a catering business serving her community's traditional foods. He talked with a young man from Bangladesh whose family owned a corner store but struggled with inventory management and tax compliance. He listened to a mother from El Salvador who was trying to save money to bring her teenage daughter to the United States, but didn't understand how banking systems worked. Each conversation reinforced Marcus's conviction that the Eleanor Chen Foundation was addressing real needs in the community. These were people with dreams and work ethic, but without access to the financial knowledge and institutional support that could turn their efforts into lasting success. As the event wound down, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see an elderly Chinese woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Liu, a neighbor who had known his grandmother. "Eleanor would be very proud," Mrs. Liu said in accented English. "She always talked about her grandson, always worried that you would have good opportunities. This foundation, this is exactly what she would want." The comment moved Marcus more than all the congratulations from officials and community leaders. This stranger's validation felt like his grandmother's blessing, confirmation that he was honoring her memory in a way she would have appreciated. Over the following months, the Eleanor Chen Foundation's programs attracted steady enrollment. The financial literacy workshops filled up quickly, with participants ranging from recent immigrants to second-generation Americans who had never learned basic money management skills. The small business development program was slower to grow, but attracted committed participants who were serious about entrepreneurship. The advocacy program proved to be in high demand, with the foundation helping dozens of people resolve disputes with landlords, employers, and financial institutions. Marcus was surprised by how often the advocacy work involved situations similar to his own experience, people being cheated by family members, friends, or community leaders who had gained their trust. One case particularly resonated with him. A woman named Maria Rodriguez had discovered that her brother-in-law, who managed her late husband's life insurance payout, had been systematically stealing from the account over several years. The theft had been hidden through forged documents and fake investment statements, leaving Maria with a fraction of the money that should have supported her and her 3 children. Marcus worked personally on Maria's case, using his experience with financial fraud and family betrayal to help her navigate the legal system. The foundation paid for legal representation, and after 8 months of litigation, Maria recovered most of the stolen money. More importantly, she gained confidence in her ability to manage her own finances and protect her family's interests. "You understand what it feels like," Maria told Marcus after the case was resolved. "Other people try to help, but they don't know how it feels when family steals from you. You know why it hurts so much." The comment crystallized something Marcus had been thinking about since the foundation launched. His personal experience with betrayal and recovery wasn't just useful for helping others navigate similar situations, it was essential. The foundation's credibility with vulnerable communities came partly from Marcus's willingness to share his own story of being victimized and fighting back. As the foundation's first year of operation concluded, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that October morning when Morrison's letter had arrived at his office. The angry, confused man who had discovered his parents' theft had evolved into someone who used his experience to help others, who had built meaningful relationships based on honesty and shared values, and who had found a purpose that went beyond personal success. The financial aspects of his transformation were obvious. The consulting business was thriving, providing Marcus with a comfortable income independent of his inheritance. The money recovered from his parents and the Brooklyn property settlement had been invested conservatively, generating enough passive income to fund the foundation's operations while preserving the principal for future growth. But the personal transformation was more significant. Marcus had learned to trust again, carefully but genuinely. His relationship with Amanda had shown him that intimacy was possible even after betrayal, that love could coexist with appropriate caution. His work with the foundation had connected him to a community of people who shared his values and appreciated his contributions. Most importantly, Marcus had found peace with his family situation. His parents continued making payments under the settlement agreement, and he occasionally received updates about their lives through Jenny. They were rebuilding their finances slowly, working regular jobs and living modestly in their rented apartment. The therapy they'd mentioned seemed to be helping them understand and accept responsibility for their actions. Marcus no longer felt angry about their betrayal. The rage that had sustained him through the legal battles had been replaced by a kind of sad acceptance. His parents had made choices that destroyed their relationship with their son, and those choices had consequences that couldn't be undone. He wished them well, but he had no desire to resume a relationship based on their late-arriving remorse. Jenny had become his real family, along with Amanda and the community of people connected to the foundation. These were relationships built on honesty, mutual respect, and shared commitment to helping others. They provided the emotional support and connection that Marcus had lost when his parents' deception was revealed. On a quiet evening in December, exactly 5 years after the trust fund betrayal had been discovered, Marcus sat in his study reviewing the foundation's annual report. The numbers told a story of steady growth and meaningful impact. 127 people had completed financial literacy workshops, 23 small businesses had been launched with the foundation's support, and 89 advocacy cases had been resolved successfully. But the statistics didn't capture the full impact of the work. Marcus thought about Maria Rodriguez, who had recovered her stolen life insurance money and was now studying to become a paralegal. He thought about the Guatemalan woman who had started her catering business and was saving money to buy a food truck. He thought about the young man from Bangladesh whose family's corner store was now thriving thanks to better inventory management and tax planning. Each success story represented someone who had gained financial security and confidence, someone who was better positioned to build generational wealth and provide opportunities for their children. It was exactly what Eleanor Chen had done for her own family, and exactly what the foundation was helping others achieve. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Amanda, who was working late at her own job. "How's the annual report looking?" He typed back, "Good, really good. This work matters." "Your grandmother would be proud," Amanda replied. Marcus smiled, knowing she was right. Eleanor Chen had spent her life building financial security for her family's future. Her grandson was now helping others do the same thing, using the wealth she had accumulated to multiply the impact of her values and work ethic. The trust fund betrayal had nearly destroyed that legacy. His parents' theft had threatened to turn her careful planning into a source of family conflict and personal bitterness. But Marcus had fought back, recovered what was rightfully his, and transformed a story of victimization into one of justice and service. Sitting in his study, surrounded by the Foundation's annual report and plans for the following year's programs, Marcus felt grateful for the painful journey that had brought him to this point. He'd lost his parents, but found his purpose. He'd been betrayed, but had learned to trust again. He'd inherited money, but had discovered that the real inheritance was the responsibility to help others build the kind of security his grandmother had worked so hard to create. Marcus Chen had been the victim of a trust fund betrayal, but he had refused to remain a victim. He had fought for justice, rebuilt his life on his own terms, and used his experience to help others facing similar challenges. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he had chosen, and he was proud of what he had built from the wreckage of his family's deception. The Eleanor Chen Foundation would continue growing, helping more immigrants and first-generation Americans achieve financial security and build generational wealth. Marcus would continue telling his story, using his experience with betrayal and recovery to help others navigate their own challenges. And somewhere, he believed, his grandmother's spirit was pleased with how her careful planning and hard work had ultimately created something much larger than she had ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.